In the last few videos, I've talked about conditionally running code in a true-false kind of scenario where I run it or I don't run it. And in this video, I'm going to show you how you can actually run code multiple times in a row. So let's take a really simple example where we just want to log out something. We're going to say console.log hi, and we want to log this out, let's say, 5 times. If we come over here, we logged out hi 5 different times. This may not be something you see all the time while you're programming, but it's really common for you to need to repeat different tasks. It may not be as simple as console logging hi, but you're definitely going to have tasks in your code that you need to repeat multiple times. And the easiest way to do that while programming is using a for loop. So in order to write a for loop, what we need to do is write the keyword for. This is going to be all lowercase, just like this. Then we need to put a set of parentheses. And you should see that this is correct if you write your lowercase for space parentheses. You'll probably see the for change colors. That's what you would expect. Inside of our parentheses is where we define our loop. We're going to skip over that just for a second. And then we're going to put our curly braces here. And inside of these curly braces is where we put the code we want to repeat over and over and over again. Let's just copy this console log hi into here, get rid of these. And now what we need to do is somehow define our for loop so that it'll run 5 times because we want to print this out 5 different times. Well, to run a for loop, what we need to do is define 3 different things. We need to first define a variable for starting. We need to define an ending point, and we also need to define how to modify our variable. Okay, so what we need to do is define a variable for where we start in our loop. It's very common to define a variable called I, which stands for index. So what we're going to do is just define a variable with the let keyword because this variable needs to be able to change. So we'll say let I equal 0. Super common programming practice is to use 0 as your starting for your loop. Just like arrays are 0 indexed, many times when you do a loop, you're going to start at a 0. But really, you need to just start at whatever makes the most sense for you. In our case, we're just going to start at 0. Then in order to get to our next section, an ending point, we need to put a semicolon. I know this is kind of weird. We don't really use the semicolon very much anywhere else, but just put the semicolon and that's going to distinguish the different sections of our loop. So now that's our first section done. We defined a variable called I, and we set it to a default starting position of 0. Now we need to define an ending point. And the way we define an ending point is we return a true-false value. If the value is true, then we continue to run our loop. And if the value is false, then we exit out of our loop. So a really easy way to create a loop that goes on forever is just to put the keyword true here. This loop is going to continually loop forever and ever and ever, and it's never ever going to end. This is a common problem that people run into when they're programming is they create an infinite loop by accident, and your code is just going to run and run and run and run, and that's obviously not what you want. Generally though, what you'll see is something related to this I variable here. So we're going to say while I is less than 5, we're going to run this loop. That's going to loop through this 5 different times because we start at 0, so it's going to go 0, that's our first one. 1 is our second iteration, 2, 3, 4, that's 5 times, and then when we get to 5, if I is 5, it's not less than 5, so this is false, and we exit out of our loop. So what we need to do is actually make I bigger each time we go through our loop. So here, we put another semicolon to indicate this is our second section, which is our ending point. And now here we could just add 1 to I. So we could say I equals I plus 1. This will increment I by 1. And if we actually run this, you'll see we get hi printed out 5 times, exactly what we want. But generally, when you're adding 1 to a variable, what you're going to see instead is just I plus plus. This is short syntax for adding 1 to a variable. It's doing the exact same thing as taking I, setting it to itself plus 1. So if we save here, we get the exact same result. So let me break this down again a little bit further. We first define a variable, which is our starting point. This is a brand new variable. Generally, this is called I, but you could call it anything in the world that you want. It does not matter. Then we set it to our starting, which is 0, put a semicolon, and that's our beginning part of our for loop. Then we define a condition, essentially true, false. If this is true, the loop runs. If it's false, it exits out. So if I is less than 5, this is true. So that's why this runs 5 times in a row, because we go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 5 iterations, and they're all less than 5. And when we finally set I to 5, it's going to exit out of this loop. Put another semicolon, and then we jump over here, which is what happens after our loop runs. So essentially what happens is when we get to our loop, we run this first section. We set I equal to 0, and then this section never runs again. Now what we do is we check this. Is this true or false? In our case, 0 is less than 5, so we run the code inside of our loop. Then, once all of the code inside of our loop runs, we come to this final section and we run it. So it says I plus plus, so we add 1 to I. Now we go back. We don't run this first section because that's just for initialization, and we go into here, we say is I, which is now equal to 1, less than 5. Well, that's true. So we're going to run our code in here again, and then run this section at the end after all of the code in our loop is done. And we're going to repeat that back and forth until we get to the point where I is equal to 5. Because 5 is not less than 5, this returns false. And now we exit out of our for loop and come and run the rest of the code. For example, if we just put console.log by here, you can see it runs hi 5 times and then logs out by. So now what happens if you accidentally create a infinite loop? Let's just say here, instead of having I less than 5, we change this to I is greater than -1. This is always going to be true because we start at 0, which is greater than -1, and we're just adding 1, so our number is always going to be greater than 1. This is going to create us an infinite loop. Same thing as if we put true here. So if we run this, what is going to happen with our code? Well, if we save, you'll notice it constantly keeps incrementing I over and over and over again. And this is going to go on forever. And the only way to actually exit out of an infinite loop when you create this in your browser is to just close out of your dev tools, and you actually need to close out of your browser itself. And then we just need to relaunch our app, but make sure we get rid of that infinite loop. So we're going to change this back to less than 5, save this, and now if we open this file back up with live server, and we come in here and we inspect, go over to our console, clear this out, just resave everything, you're going to notice that we now have our code working as we would expect. So if you accidentally create an infinite loop, just make sure you close out of your browser, close out of your dev tools, close out of all of the tabs that have your website open, fix the infinite loop, and then rerun your code. It's pretty common to create infinite loops when you're starting, so it's important to know how to actually exit out of those infinite loops. If we were using Node, for example, so if we come in here and we were to say Node, and we were to run this, which is just script.js, you can see it prints out hi 5 times then by. We had an infinite loop here, we instead had, I is greater than -1. What I'm first going to do is just close out of all this browser stuff so we don't get the loop over there. Save this and run this. You're going to notice it's just continually printing out hi over and over and over and over and over and over again. It's never going to exit. All you need to do is hit Control and then C. That instantly kills your program and allows you to exit out of an infinite loop. So if you're in Node and you create an infinite loop by accident, use Control plus C to instantly kill your program and exit out of that loop. Then you can come in here, fix your code, click save, and now if you run it again, it's going to work as you would expect. So let's open this back up in the browser here. Get the inspect here so we can actually see our console. And there we go. Everything is working as expected. Now, probably the most common use case you have for a loop is if you need to go from one number to another, but you can use a loop in order to access elements in an array. This is something you might see in some older code that was around before the for each method was created. So we can say const a is equal to an array, and we're just going to say in here a, b, c. It's just a 3 length array with a, b, and c inside of it. And you want to loop through this array without using a.forEach, because a.forEach is by far the easiest and recommended way to do it, but sometimes you'll see older code that does this a slightly different way. It'll create a variable, in our case I, set it to 0, and then it's going to say while I is less than the length of our array. Because our length of our array is 3, so while I is less than 3, we're going to loop through and then add 1 to I each time. Then we can create a variable called element and just set it equal to a index of I. And what this is doing is it's looping from I equals 0 all the way to I equals 1 less than the length of our array. So our array is 3. So it's going to go here 0, 1, 2, and that's what I is going to equal. And that's going to give us our individual elements. So we can say console.log element. Get rid of this by down here, and you can see it prints out ABC. This is a very common thing that you'll see in older code before the existence of the for each loop, but I always recommend using for each instead of writing out a cumbersome for loop like this, because these are very easy to mess up, and for each is super simple and does all the hard work for you. Now the final thing, if we just go back here a little ways where all we were doing, we were printing out hi, there we go, just like this. What you can do with these for loops, just like with if statements, is if you have one single line of code in your for loop, you can actually remove the curly braces and put it all in one line like this, and it's going to run just that one individual line of code after your for. Again, I recommend never doing this. It's just confusing. It's hard to know what's going on. It's difficult to read. And if you ever need to add a second line, you need to make sure to put in your curly braces, and then you can come in here and say console.log of, new code. And then it's going to work as you would expect. But this is just more work for you, so I recommend always using curly braces. Even if you just have one line like this, it's just going to make your life so much easier. Now, the final thing I want to talk about with for loops is the use of the break keyword and the continue keyword. So just like when you were in a switch statement and you could use break to exit out of your switch statement, you can actually use break inside of a for loop to exit out of the for loop. So let's take a look at an example of that. We can say, for example, if I is greater than 2, then we want to call break here. And now if I save this, you're going to notice it prints out high 3 times. When I is equal to 0, when I is equal to 1, and while I is equal to 2. But as soon as I is equal to 3, this if statement is true, and we run break. And what break does is it says, cut out of the for loop. It's essentially the same as setting this to true. We're saying exit out of the for loop completely. Don't run any other code inside of here. And that's exactly what happens. So if we put a console.log up here that just says start, and this says end, let's just get rid of all this stuff down here. You can see it prints out start, end, start, end, start, end, and then it prints out start, gets to this code where I is greater than 2 because I is 3. It breaks out of this loop, and then it doesn't ever log this end. It just completely exits out of the loop. Another thing that you can use instead of break is the continue keyword here. So we can use continue. Let's change this just to print out I. And down here, we're going to print out end plus I, just like that. And we'll actually just do start plus I. There we go. So you can see start 0, end 0, start 1, end 1, start 2, end 2, and then start 3, start 4. The reason that this happens is this continue keyword is very similar to break, but instead of exiting out of the entire for loop, all it does is exit out of this current iteration of the for loop. So what we do is, we have I equal to 0, 1, 2, and then when we get I equal to 3, it says start 3 right here. It says I is greater than 2, which in our case 3 is greater than 2, so it's true. It sees continue and it says, okay, skip everything else after the continue. Run this code here where it adds 1 to I. Check this, I less than 5 again, and then continue on with your for loop. So it really is just saying that I want to break out of this iteration of the for loop, but I don't want to exit out of the entire for loop. These are things that you really honestly don't see that often inside of code. It's pretty often that you'll see breaks if you need to exit out of a for loop prematurely, but you don't see that too often. And continue is something you really don't see very much at all inside of for loops. So I wouldn't worry too much about them, but it's important to know that they exist and that you can actually work with them. So finally, I want to give you your own project to create your own for loop. So I want you to create a for loop that loops from 0 to 10 and prints out all values from 0 to 10. I want you to do that. Then what I want you to do is modify this loop and exit the loop when the value is equal to 5 by using break. And that's it. So essentially create a loop that prints out from 0 to 10 and make sure it prints out the value 10. That's going to be important. And then what I want you to do is just modify the loop by using break to exit out prematurely when the value is equal to 5. So pause the video, give yourself a chance to do this, and then I'll show you how it works. So hopefully you've had a chance to create this. Let's come up here and we're going to create our for loop. So we'll say for let I equal to 0 because we're printing from 0 to 10. Then what I want to do is I want to say while I is less than or equal to 10 because I want to print out 10. So we're going to say while I is less than or equal to 10, print out the values. And we're just going to add 1 to I each time with that I++. Then inside of here, I'm just going to log out that I variable. Let's save this, and you can see we get 0 through 10 being printed out. Okay, that's great. We got that working. Now the next step is to modify this loop and exit the loop when the value is equal to 5 by using break. So we can just say if we have I equal to 5, then we just break. And if I save, you see it as soon as I is equal to 5, we're breaking, and it's not actually printing that out. And you'll notice I like to put this on one line here. And that's just because this break keyword is so short and so confined that it's simple to put it on one line. But if you prefer, you can definitely put it on multiple lines like this with your curly braces. They do the exact same thing. When I have a simple keyword like break or return or continue, I'll generally put that on one line like this as I find the code easier to read myself, but it's entirely personal preference. You can do it whichever way works best for you. And that is everything you need to know about the for loop. Generally, you'll probably be using for each loops instead of for loops for pretty much all of your looping needs, but every once in a while you need to just loop between two stationary numbers, and this is where a for loop is perfect. In the next video, we're going to be talking about a while loop, which is another form of loop that you can use to repeat code, but it works a little bit differently. I can't wait to see you in that video.